Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Steve Johnson, and I want to welcome you to this question and answer period for Theories of Addictions. This is the last week of the course. And of course, throughout the week of the two lectures that were made on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we've looked at behavioral or process addictions. And so I've had a number of questions that have come up. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to fill in the chat, and I will look at that and try to do my best to respond to that. Um, uh, I don't see a question being posed or a response being posed. So let me go to the first question that I did receive. If most of behavioral addictions are not listed in the DSM-5, how can we know that there are evidence-based treatments for that? Well, there are three parts to that question. One is, if a particular behavioral addiction is not listed as such within the DSM-5, that doesn't mean that it's not a real condition. Uh, it just means that there's no diagnostic criteria yet for that. The second point would be that there has been considerable research into the treatment of different behavioral addictions, and the research is ongoing, and that we hope that some of those treatments will kind of raise to the level of evidence-based treatments over time. And maybe the third point is that while those the research is promising, the field tends to be rather conservative, and I think that's a good thing, rather conservative about declaring a treatment to be evidence-based for treating any particular condition. So sometimes it will take a number of years before a treatment is labeled as evidence-based by Division 12 of the APA, or elsewhere, SAMHSA, whatever. Okay, so really good question. The second question is that if the diagnostic criteria for gambling is used as typical for other behavioral addictions, isn't there a chance of misconceptualizing the other behavioral addictions? What a fantastic question. In case some of you don't know, the only behavioral addiction that is listed specifically as such in the DSM-5 it's under the substance use disorder and addiction category. So, gambling is the only one. That doesn't mean that there are not other behavioral addictions. However, since the gambling has made it in the DSM-5 criteria, many people have used the diagnostic criteria for it to be the starting point for looking at the diagnostic criteria for other behavioral addictions. So absolutely, there is the chance of, if we use the diagnostic criteria for gambling, to conceptualize the other behavioral addictions, that we could be misconceptualizing those other behavioral addictions. However, behavioral addictions do have some similarities. Otherwise, there would be no way to label them all as behavioral addictions. So they do have some similarities, and these would be captured in some of the diagnostic criteria, at least in the more general diagnostic criteria for gambling. But the details, or maybe the differentiating criteria, would evolve over time as more diagnostic criteria, more behavioral addictions enter into the DSM-5 or subsequent editions of the DSM. So again, excellent question. The third question is, it's very interesting, because this gets to one of the reasons for the changes that are made within the DSM-5. Aren't behavioral addictions such as workaholism dependent on culture? Well, as you know, in the DSM-5, they really wanted us, diagnosticians to spend some time looking at any cultural factors that may impinge upon the diagnosis or inform the diagnosis. So I think it would be surprising if cultural attitudes were irrelevant in the diagnosis of of workaholism or any of the other behavioral addictions. However, we should note that even within a culture, there are criteria for determining whether the behavioral addiction is sabotaging someone from attaining reaching other of their life goals that are valued, or whether they contribute to poor health. For example, sun tanning, doing tanning beds and that kind of stuff does allegedly contributes to skin cancer. So clearly, even within a culture, if something is contributing to some major condition like cancer, then we would probably be able to say that that is dysfunctional. I do think that when we look at the conceptualization, we do need to kind of filter it through the hierarchy of values within that culture, but not just the hierarchy of values within the culture, because the client herself or himself may have a hierarchy of values that some of which, but not all of which, may reflect the hierarchy of values within the culture. So, excellent question. And yes, we do need to take the cultural criteria rather seriously. Just an example on that one, I was reading about, my specialty is PTSD or trauma disorders. And I was looking at an excellent paper on how they were trying to develop diagnostic criteria for diagnosing PTSD within Afghanistan. And it was a cultural challenge because in the DSM-5, which is largely a Western construction, the diagnostic criteria tended to focus on the individual who had experienced the trauma. However, when they those who were psychologists, and I think this was even missionaries who were working with individuals in Afghanistan, had the realization that when an individual had been traumatized, often when they reported their symptoms, the symptoms were not in terms of the impact of the trauma upon the self, but the impact upon others, their behavior, their emotions, and their impact upon others in the community. So they were trying to come up with a measure that they could use to get at that cultural piece that was missing in the DSM-5 construction of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So very good, very, very good question. Fourth is, if exercise helps raise the serotonin levels, which can contribute to an overall sense of better mood or happiness whatsoever, why would that be an addiction? That sounds like if we're raising serotonin levels and creating happiness in an individual, then why would we want to, give a really negative diagnosis there? Well, I think the issue is not the elevation of the serotonin that is problematical. I think we need to, not be overly focused on one factor, but there are other factors when an individual is purportedly addicted to exercise. So it may be the inordinate amount of time that the individual is spending on the exercise, or the compulsion to exercise, or how they ignore other life duties and relationships because of the time that's going on, or even it may impede or negatively impact their work, or sometimes even the physical injuries or problems that arise because of exercising too much without giving the body time to recover. If I look at this more specifically from an REBT perspective, one thing I would say is that One difference between healthy exercise and dysfunctional exercise would be in the irrational beliefs or the beliefs that an individual holds. If it is a healthy form of exercising, then they would be holding rational beliefs, both inferences and beliefs. Whereas if that exercise is dysfunctional and unhealthy, then they would most likely uh, hold irrational beliefs such as demanding as like, I absolutely have to exercise this much or that would be horrible. And if those beliefs are what are driving the behavior of exercise, that could be uh, dysfunctional. So we would also want to look at the cognitions involved there, as well as health factors and how it impinges relationships, etc. Relationships in many different domains of life. Another question is, don't people with behavioral addictions also have a personality disorder? Good question, but the answer is not necessarily. Um, but one could have both. One could have a behavioral addiction and certainly one or more of the personality uh, disorders. Um, for example, let's take a look at, uh, well, if we check with the DSM 5 diagnostic criteria for personality disorder, then we would see that there may be, and the REBT conceptualization, then we might see that the dysfunctional inferences and beliefs that would be evident in individuals who have been diagnosed with a personality disorder could function to support some kind of behavioral addiction too. So they may share negative inferences or false inferences and inadequate or unhelpful beliefs. So there could be some overlap there, and so a propensity toward a behavioral addiction. So we need to check with the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria and never assume that what seems logical is empirical. We might go, oh, it just makes sense. If we sit around and go, it makes sense, it makes logical sense that if you had a personality disorder, then you probably have a behavioral addiction. Or if you have a behavioral addiction, you probably have a personality disorder. This is not an issue for sitting around and doing logical thinking or what we think makes sense. It's not enough to think that it's logical. We have to see whether it is actually empirical. Because if there's no empirical evidence to support that, then we cannot make that connection, as much as it may seem logical to us. I often say that what is logical may not be ontological, or what is logical may not be empirical. That's why we have science to determine those relationships. Another question is, could someone have more than one behavioral addiction? Absolutely. As in personality disorders, people could have multiple personality disorders. They could have multiple anxiety disorders. If they fulfill the diagnostic criteria, then they could have multiple behavioral addictions. And in fact, that is quite common. So, for example, let's say that someone has some form of eating addiction or eating disorder, and they have an exercise behavioral addiction. Well, the anorexia, if we're talking about that, is marked by false inferences about body image and dysfunctional beliefs resulting from, you know, uh, uh, resulting in their behavior of food restriction. And so, someone with an exercise behavioral addiction may share some of the same kind of false inferences with respect to body image and share some of the same beliefs. So in that case, it would be really common to see someone share like an eating addiction or disorder there, and an exercise addiction. So there are all kinds of combinations, because always, if we look at the diagnostic criteria, for example, if you look at the section on substance use disorder, you'll see that there are a core set of symptoms that are common to all substance use addictions. And so clearly, if behavioral addictions, there would be a common core of diagnostic criteria that would be shared among all of them, so that very easily could be a predisposition to multiple behavioral addictions. And then the last question I got, unless somebody who's on has a question, and if you do, then please feel free to, enter the chat of the question you have or a comment that you have about the behavioral process addictions. Feel free. The last question that I have here, if we don't hear from someone else, is couldn't there be so many different behavioral addictions which that someone could have, multiple people have multiple behavioral addictions, and there are so many of those that soon the DSM-5 would be filled with those behavioral addictions? Well, I guess that, that's really a good question. I hadn't thought about that, but theoretically, that's why we also look at kind of obsessions and compulsions, and look for whatever the person's diagnosis is, even if that their behavioral addiction hasn't even entered into the DSM-5, so that we can't diagnose it. We would say in any kind of behavior to look at, are there obsessions and compulsions associated with that, and look at the resulting behavior, and is it causing damage in relationships or in different domains of their life, or even causing physical damage. Then we could treat that and those problems, whether or not there's an actual category within the DSM-5. So one other thing along those lines, which is really, really important, is that I think it is always important, and I say this to my students all the time, that we actually never treat conditions, because the conditions that we find within the DSM-5 are abstractions. They're concepts. For example, depression. Depression is not a real thing. What is real are the symptoms, and we put those symptoms together, and then we give it a label. We use a term to point to it, and we call that, for example, major depressive disorder. But the major depressive disorder is not something that you can see. It is the symptoms are the reality. That is just the label. So I think when we have to remember that when we're not treating the depression. Let's just take depression, for example. Even with the DSM diagnostic criteria, remember, for adults, there has to be at least there's one necessary, but certainly not sufficient condition, and that is sadness that persists for over 2 weeks. Children, it might be more agitation, frustration and agitation. And then there may be, we have to have 5 among the 9 diagnostic criteria, whatever. However, those 5 do not have to be the same for each person. Of course, there's going to be overlap because we only have 9 criteria and you have to have 5. So there will be overlap from person to person, but the particular mix of symptoms would be different from person to person. And yet, all of them are going to get the label of, say, a major depressive disorder, but their symptoms are different. So we might need to, in one case, treat a symptom that another individual with the same label, the same diagnosis, doesn't even have. So it is really important, and I say this for my students all the time, don't think of these diagnostic criteria within the DSM-5 as realities. They are terms. They are abstractions. The realities are the symptoms. It's really interesting. I was just reading about the treatment for personality disorders for a psychopharmacology class that I'm developing. And one of the things that was being discussed was when it comes to the treatment of personality disorders, and the decisions are being made by the prescriber of the medications, for example, psychiatrist or whomever, that the advice was, remember, you are not treating the particular diagnosis of a particular personality disorder. You are treating the symptoms. So, for example, if the individual is highly anxious, you're treating the anxiety. If they're having bursts of anger, then there are some SSRIs sometimes that are prescribed for people who are inordinately angry, or if they're avoidant, then which we also see with those symptoms, those diagnoses that have anxiety, then we would be treating the avoidance. So we would be treating those emotions and behaviors and certain levels of physiological arousal that may be used. So I think across the board, and even in behavioral addictions, I think it's really important for us to realize we treat symptoms. And I was really was talking to Wendy Dryden not too long ago, and it's really interesting his single session therapy. And that single session therapy, they're not spending a lot of time. I mean, if you need a diagnosis, then of course you can come up with a diagnosis. But a lot of times people come in with very particular problems or very particular symptoms, and you treat those symptoms. They may go away, and then if they need help some more, then they come back in. And I think that's a really great model. Those people that need like ongoing kinds of treatment and want that, of course, that's available. But other people might want, I'm just dealing with right now, I'm having the trouble with anxiety. And so you work on the anxiety and you go, oh, well, you know what? Some depression has come in. So you go in, you get treated for the depression. So treat for the symptoms and not the diagnosis. However, if there's a diagnosis, then we communicate in the field. We communicate in terms of the diagnosis. But when I read, let's say I inherit a client, then I get the other therapist gets a release of information form signed by the client, and then I get the folder or the report of intake or progress note or whatever. Then I could read the symptoms that were being treated. It says we were treating the depression. I don't know, but it's more helpful for me to see whether an individual is getting better or worse or staying the same in the treatment of the particular symptoms of that disorder, the depression or whatever is being treated. So thank you very much. It looks like no one has sent me a chat saying that they have any questions. So this is the last one that we have for the Theories of Addictions course, but I will be posting on the Facebook page, RABT Education and Training, particular kinds of workshops. Just this week, I did one on treating PTSD, and we will be having one monthly. And so look for it in that Facebook page. And then I usually do these live through YouTube. So thank you guys so much, and for taking time out of your busy day and coming to listen to this. And I just hope you have a great remainder of the day. All the best, and bye-bye.